On December 20th, 2019, President Trump passed a law that raised the legal age to purchase tobacco products from 18 to 21. The law went into effect immediately, meaning that from here on out, you have to be the same age to purchase tobacco as you had to be, and still have to be, to purchase alcohol in the United States. This fact, this sense of parity between drinking and smoking, actually raises an interesting question though. Namely, how was the government able to do that? I don't mean like procedurally. Like, this bill came into creation the same way that most other ones did. Passed the House, passed the Senate, signed by the president, bada bing, bada boom, you got yourself a law. You know, typical Schoolhouse Rock kind of stuff.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
No, I mean more like, how did they get the authority for this to go through the standard channel? Because they certainly didn't have it for alcohol. Longtime viewers of the channel may remember that I actually talked about why the drinking age is 21 in the United States. In fact, it was actually the very first video I ever put up on this channel. Don't feel compelled to watch it. It's like 5 years old with even worse production quality than normal. The gist is that the federal government didn't have the authority to demand that the drinking age be 21 everywhere. Or more accurately, it didn't want to test to see if they had that authority, since it had apparently been relinquished when they repealed the 18th Amendment. Because of the considerable latitude given to states' rights in the United States, they had to go with a carrot and stick approach. The federal government threatened to not give states any highway funding monies unless they went ahead and raised the drinking age to 21 by themselves. So if it took them encouraging state action on drinking, on what grounds were they able to circumvent that route with smoking? Now, some people familiar with the issue may be thinking that the federal government didn't circumvent the states, because shoot, that's actually what I thought too. Those of you who have heard about the law might have read that it came as just one part of a massive spending bill that forestalled another end-of-year government shutdown. Which is good, because that would be a pretty terrible thing to make into a holiday tradition. But while the law passed in conjunction with other spending provisions, it doesn't use the same carrot and stick philosophy as drinking did. Instead, the government basically just said, oh, and by the way, this is how it is now, and a bunch of other spending stuff is happening right now too. What gives? Did the government just one day up and decide that they, and not the states, had the authority when it came to smoking? Was this bill a silent usurping of states' rights? No. Well, actually, I mean, kind of. Yes to the government up and deciding bit, but the story is really not as dramatic as the whole usurping would make it sound. The story is informative though, particularly about when and how things transition from being a state issue to a national one, because it turns out smoking absolutely started out as a state issue. Tobacco's history is inexorably interwoven with that of the nation. It was one of the South's most important cash crops. Just like today, the production and sale of tobacco products had the potential to mint millions several times over. But it was known pretty early on that this hot commodity was hard to drop. There were reports dating back to the 1700s of people having difficulty quitting. We know now this is primarily due to the nicotine in the leaves, which, fun fact, actually evolved as a natural insecticide. In the brains of bugs, it interrupts neurotransmitters between what passes for their brain and muscles, including those needed to maintain life. In our brains, however, it binds to receptors that ultimately cause an increase in dopamine. This facilitates the dependency and addiction to nicotine and indirectly to smoking tobacco. But back then, they just knew that people wanted to quit, but really couldn't. They could also put two and two together and realize that it wasn't exactly the healthiest habit one could have. So individual states started adjusting their legal age to access tobacco. Most opted for ages between 18 and 21. Some were lower, about 14 to 16. Many didn't even have a specific age limit at all, just saying that minors weren't allowed. Which I'm sure went over great during the gold and silver rushes during the periods of Western expansion. Get it? Get it? Minors. Working on them dad jokes. Shoot, a few states actually banned access to tobacco, period, during the Progressive Era. Although, that went about as well as the era's other efforts at prohibition. But the turn of the 20th century saw an explosion in the ability of tobacco companies to reach new potential customers, sometimes by dint of literal explosions. The War Department included rations of cigarettes during World War II, a practice that continued up until just the end of the Vietnam War. In comparison, the last time we had an official military alcohol ration was the Civil War. Efforts like these, plus advertising in magazines, over the radio, and on television, made cigarettes socially acceptable. Hell, they didn't just advertise between shows, they made shows that could be the vehicles of advertisement. It's literally how we got the Flintstones. By the 1950s, we had reams of scientific evidence that showed that tobacco products were harmful to those who consumed them. After it came out that tobacco companies were spending millions to falsify studies of their own showing no ill effects, or, even better, positive effects to tobacco smoking, there was enough political momentum to start laying down some ground rules. But not too many ground rules. Tobacco was still a huge industry in a bunch of states. Starting back in the early 1900s, when the government was just getting into the whole regulating food, drugs, and drink business, tobacco companies lobbied Congress to come out and defend the industry as quintessentially American. The rules that did pass, though, often tried to kill smoking through long, drawn-out economic suffocation, which,
ironic.
Studies at the time show, and indeed studies continuing on through today show, that most smokers began the habit before their mid-20s, sometimes well before. If the government could stop kids from picking up the habit, they could lower the social cost of smoking over time without resorting to a ban. Most of the laws that passed at this time were about informing citizens, especially kids, about the health risks and preventing the spread of misleading advertisements. By 1992, the government settled on an age of 18, in part because tobacco companies spent loads of money arguing that higher age restrictions were historically unprecedented, despite knowing that, as I mentioned before, some states had 21 as a legal age and others had actually banned the practice less than a century before. The way the government did that, though, was by the carrot and stick method. They hitched state grants for drug enforcement monies to the states enforcing an 18-year-old minimum. Same general idea as alcohol. But in 1996, the FDA tried to claim that it had the authority to regulate tobacco products. No state-level stuff required. And although Congress could certainly pass laws to, limit, expand, or clarify this prerogative, the FDA claimed that they didn't need them to regulate the commerce of tobacco products. They argued that Congress gave them the authority to regulate drugs and drug applicators in 1938 with the passage of the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act. Since nicotine affects mood and the brain, it could be readily classified as a drug. And since tobacco was the applicator for said drug, they could regulate that too. But that didn't exactly float with tobacco companies, who took the issue to the Supreme Court, and it didn't float with them either. See, this position the FDA was taking, that it could regulate tobacco products, was totally contrary to the decades of instances when they would lament that they didn't have the authority. But when prompted to explain why they now thought that they did, they kind of basically did the legal equivalent of shrugging their shoulders and said, "'Cause?" But interestingly, neither the majority opinion or the dissenting opinion on that case questioned whether the national government had the ability to regulate tobacco, rather than keeping it a state's issue. In fact, the majority basically said, if you want the FDA to regulate tobacco, make sure Congress just passes a law that says you can do that. Then you're all set. Or, to put it verbatim, no matter how important, conspicuous, and controversial the issue, and regardless of how likely the public is to hold the executive branch politically accountable, an administrative agency's power to regulate in the public interest must always be grounded in a valid grant of authority from Congress. Courts must take care to not extend a statute's scope beyond the point where Congress indicated it would stop. And although it took them almost a decade, Congress did. In 2009, President Obama signed the Family Smoking and Prevention Control Act, which explicitly gave the FDA authority to regulate tobacco products in the United States. What President Trump recently passed was actually an amendment to this law that basically said, by the way, selling to anyone under the age of 21 is now illegal. Okay, thanks. Astute viewers may be thinking, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense. What changed between 1992 and 1996 to make it that the FDA thought it could take power away from the states? What about from 1992 to 2000, where the courts subtly repudiated the idea that it's a states' rights issue by suggesting that Congress could just pass a law to make the issue go away? Like, what am I missing here? The answer is that you're not missing anything. It legitimately doesn't make any sense. Or at least it isn't ideologically consistent. It actually makes perfect sense when we stop thinking about laws as being like the distilled essence of lofty principles given form through ink and enforcement. They're messier than that. More accurately, they're what falls out when something becomes salient and then is subjected to the contestation of power holders. Over the decades prior, tobacco was firmly established as an issue of national importance, but when we compare it to other issues that ultimately got enfolded into a broader call for states' rights, like abortion, gay marriage, busing, the environment, healthcare, civil rights, it was because they were salient to lots of everyday people in ways that smoking just isn't. Nor could smoking be neatly enfolded into broader frames that could get people riled up. Although, believe me, tobacco companies tried. They just realized that it was a losing battle when the incontrovertible evidence that it was bad for you, caught up with them, as well as them trying to suppress said evidence. Which is why they sued over the 2009 law, because, of course they did. But it wasn't challenging the government's ability to regulate their products, but the way that they were able to advertise their products. That is to say, their suits were on First Amendment grounds. Although it should be noted that all of those cases were ultimately decided in favor of the government. And tobacco companies were probably right to not try to contest the issue with the amendment that President Trump signed into law. Recent surveys show that 75% of the public supports a raise in the minimum age of tobacco access to 21. So it's not like they're going to be able to tap into this groundswell of public support. Basically, the reason that Congress was able to assert that the national government had unilateral control over the minimum age of tobacco is because tobacco companies didn't contest that issue. And tobacco companies didn't contest that issue because they knew that they couldn't rally the public support. They didn't have the power to assert this as a states' rights issue. And the realities of power matter more in the creation of policy than ideological consistency. Curious to see what you guys think about all this. Do you agree that the minimum age for access to tobacco products should be 21 here in the United States? Do you think that it should have had to go through the states' rights routes like alcohol had to and like tobacco itself had to back in the 90s? This is one of those issues that for me seemed kind of like boring a little, honestly, on the surface level, but the more you dig into it, the more interesting it got. So I'm really curious to see what your guys' thoughts are about all of this, about the thoughts that cropped up while watching this video or suggestions for future topics. I'm always happy to have those down in the comment section below. Looking forward to reading all of them, answering a few in the next office hours. It has been a while since I uploaded a video, and I'd like to thank your guys' patience for that. It's honestly a little harder to balance this with my obligations for work, with my obligations for family, with my mental health, as well as trying to adjust to the fact and get everything ready for the fact that I'm gonna be a father. Like, it's coming up. It's early March, guys. Like, this is gonna be a thing very soon. I think that right now I'm in a much better space than I was, even just 2 or 3 months ago. So I think that I'll be able to keep up the bi-weekly schedule up until Rose is born. And at that point, we'll see. Part of me thinks that, I'll take a couple weeks off for paternity leave, maybe take one video off. But also part of me thinks that I will probably use an opportunity. I'd like the opportunity to have a few minutes to be able to create something, even if it's small, just because I'll probably not be sleeping anyways. So there very well could be a video. Just don't expect the world in terms of production quality, which you guys already don't. So just lower your bar so it's even lower. Special thanks to those supporting Professor Politics on Patreon. I'd like to give a shout out to research assistant Joel. Patrons get exclusive content, early content, and shout outs. So if you'd like to be able to help, you can click the link down in the doobly-doo or at the end card at the end of the video. I really appreciate it. I'm not going to be doing comment responses off of the last video because that was like almost 2 months ago, back in 2019, and we're going to start 2020 with a fresh slate. So leave your comments down for this one, and I'll be responding to them in the next office hours. Sources for everything is always be down in the doobly-doo, as well as links Facebook, Twitter, and the blog. Look forward to seeing you guys out there as well. If you enjoyed this video, hope you consider giving it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, and by subscribing to the channel to stay in the loop for more awesome social science content is uploaded. You want to be guaranteed to be in the loop when I upload a new video? Be sure to click the bell icon as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.